Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Evangelical Dark Web. Today and tonight, I guess, we're going to be talking about the latest controversy regarding the Tucker Carlson experience. That's not really what his podcast is called, but we're going to be talking about his latest podcast episode with Daryl Cooper and the evangelical response to that, which definitely has been pretty intellectually anemic, if I do say so. Uh, some people just did not listen to it. And by some, I probably mean most of the people who are criticizing it did not actually listen to what was said in the actual podcast. And it does show. Uh, so that's kind of my initial read on the situation. And the big one that we're going to talk about tonight is Al Mohler's response, which I think will tell us a lot. I want to get your thoughts before we continue.
So I watched this interview before or during the time period where it was starting to like blow up and go viral. Like I know people were cooking with it, and I watched it on Monday, so people were starting to chatter about it. But I didn't realize how much it would blow up. And obviously, he's reciting dissident right talking points, but really just a larger paleoconservative argument. I mean, I know Martyr Made is kind of is an atheist or seemingly so, and some of his thoughts on Christianity are more or less Reddit tier. But at the same time, World War II is not the same type of history as like biblical history. So, just because he's trash in one area doesn't necessarily mean he's inaccurate or dishonest on World War II. So, because I did see a lot of Christians saying, "Hey, this is the guy you're listening to with like this take about God is the enemy in Job," and again, he does have some trash takes, but I am familiar with Martyr Made. I do follow him, but
Okay, so you're more
again,
familiar with him?
a little bit.
Okay, I'm not overly. I know I've seen him around, but I'm not very familiar with his game, if I do say so myself. But let's talk about the not controversial aspect of the interview. I thought the part on the Jonestown was actually pretty enlightening because no one ever talks about, the race component of Jonestown and the fact that this dude was like your woke social justice activist, and a lot of his followers were black women. I just thought that that was kind of interesting, and that's something that no one ever talked about
I mean, he
regarding
was able
Jonestown.
to parallel how that basically had the same meteoric rise and fall as the overall civil rights movement. So I thought that was an interesting parallel. I mean, again, and you can kind of see some of his worldview shortcomings in that Jonestown segment when he talks about how the mother that slashed her own children's throat like loved her child. So he
No,
does say
that
that.
is the opposite of love. That is
Yeah.
hatred.
But
The
he
Bible
does go
calls
there.
that murder with hatred.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's
So I
not a
mean, he does
loving way
have
to do that.
worldview shortcomings that did seep out even without going into the Churchill part. But overall, I mean, his insight, like near autistic levels of insight and interest in like the Jonestown. He also did Jeffrey Epstein apparently. And John Harris says it's the best research on, or maybe not John Harris said that, but John Harris liked his Jeffrey Epstein stuff apparently.
I don't know. I haven't seen his stuff on that, but what's interesting is he didn't say anything new. Regarding Churchill, he did not say anything new, and I got some clips that I kind of want to say about that. But he's being called a Hitler apologist, and I just feel like that's a completely asinine thing. He does not really express love for Adolf Hitler in the entire interview at all. Uh, Nor does he even address the Holocaust, which people are calling him a Holocaust denier. He didn't touch the Holocaust.
No, I
I
mean when he's talking about POWs, he is
He's talking
strictly
about.
talking about the Russian. He's strictly talking about the Russians and the supply chain. And keep in mind the supply chain issues. Just to give you a history lesson, of course, that goes back to World War One, and obviously you could talk about Churchill doing naval blockades, but Germany always had a food supply issue, and they were always dependent on like Argentina to import their nitro or to export their nitrates to them. And during that time period of World War One, you have the chemistry behind the Haber process. I think that's what it's called, but basically it allows for the creation of nitrates despite the chemical reaction not being favorably, like the energy flow of the chemical reaction being disfavorable. So you're able to overcompensate for the energy flow through the Haber process, which I believe that guy earned a Nobel Prize. But that would literally allowed for Germany to create fertilizers, which then allowed them to prolong themselves in the war. But the idea that Germans didn't have like food supply issues and logistical like strains on that end, yeah, that was always a problem for Germany.
Yeah, and I'm going to show a clip of uh, Buchanan, Pat Buchanan, in a second. But I kind of resonate with him in the clip that I'm going to show. It's like Hitler isn't really, he's not really a heroic figure, obviously, and no one's really claiming that he is. I mean, there are some people out there that do. I just don't because at the end of the day, John Doyle put out a recent video about theater kids and the government. Adolf Hitler was a theater kid. If we're going to be real about the biography of Adolf Hitler, he was a highly emotional theater kid. And the thing about Adolf Hitler is he does not have a plan. He is a guy that doesn't really have a plan. He's someone maybe with good political instincts, but he doesn't have a grand plan. He's just reacting and gambling. And that's kind of what he is. He is a gambler, a high stakes gambler. And that got him in prison once. That got him, the presidency or the chancellorship as well. So he's playing a high stakes game and it continues to escalate. And then, he goes into Poland, doesn't think that there's going to be a war declared against him. For some reason, he thought that he could declare war on the United States without a plan because they didn't have a plan for that. And then he took a huge gamble with Operation Barbarossa to preemptively knock out the Soviet Union before they could take advantage of Germany in a prolonged war with the British. So he's not really a guy that strikes me as having a cohesive plan. It's just reaction and gambling, high risk, high reward, moves. I mean, even going through the Ardennes forest to circumvent the Maginot Line because the French decided not to complete it. They left a hole in it. Even that was a high risk move that only worked because the French didn't believe their own reconnaissance, who told them about a bottleneck in the forest that they could have just bombed.
Also, ketamines and like
Amphetamines, yeah. I mean,
yeah, the idea of that you can just dope your soldiers and have them, I guess, long form their war and just prolong their, I guess, their
I
stamina.
mean, if you did a power rankings of European powers, let's just take America and Japan out of the picture for a second. European powers, I guess I would put Germany at fourth. They're probably the fourth most powerful nation at the start of World War II. The British are number one, the French are number two, and probably the Russians are at three. And that's just because of size. But the Russian army historically has always been as large as it is ineffective, with a few exceptions here and there. But that's my read. Like, they're the fourth most powerful country in Europe at the start of World War II, and they overperform. Like, the idea that, Hitler was going to conquer the British is really stupid.
No, I
And
mean
I
the
don't think
whole
people understand
he
that.
was like the whole boomer talking point of it. If not for us, we'd be speaking German or whatever, and that's just not true. I mean, first of all, America was never under threat from the European campaign, simply because they didn't have the naval capacity to even.
They had a tiny navy, and I believe they only had like 2 capital ships. We know the Bismarck being one of them, and then they converted a lot of merchant vessels into warships, and they're like cruising the Pacific Ocean and fighting in that theater. But again, and then they relied on submarines. But at the end of the day, how did the Allies take out their submarines? Bombing their ports. They had to go to port sometime. But this is not a naval power, and so they were never going to take out the British. They were never going to launch an invasion of the British Isles. That is extremely difficult to do. The last person who did that was William the Conqueror in 1066, the Battle of Hastings. And the only reason William the Conqueror even won was because the King of England was a spent force. They already successfully defended the claim against, I believe, Harold of Norway, because everyone was laying claim to the English crown, and the de facto king successfully defended his title, but he was a spent force. William the Conqueror comes, Battle of Hastings. It was a close battle, but William the Conqueror prevailed. I can't remember I think it's King Harold was the guy who lost. But in any case, that was pretty difficult. No one has successfully invaded the British Isles since 1066. The Spanish tried during the famous Spanish Armada, and I guess a lot of people hadn't watched, Billy Madison, and they don't understand, that was a disaster. And actually, the only other thing that was a disaster was the English Armada, which was a response. But invading the British Isles, pretty difficult to do. Amphibious invasions, extremely difficult, and the Germans were never going to pull that off. And to me, they lost the war with the Battle of London when they, thought that the British didn't have an air defense system all over their island. So they gambled and lost, and their biggest advantage was probably in the air. But even things like Blitzkrieg have their limitations. And there's always it's like the Bible story in the book of Judges where the guy who's left-handed stabs the fat king or whatever, the fat dude,
And he's so fat,
and
the
his
sword
sword goes into him. It's like that's pretty much what it's like invading the Russians. There's only so much you can blitzkrieg that.
So a lot of this whole Churchill conversation is kind of the next level up of like controversial to like the whole dropping the atom bomb conversation, because that also was, I believe Tucker Carlson also spurred a lot of that dialogue in the recent months.
I'm not as familiar. I think that was a year ago
No, maybe.
because
Well,
I believe
Oppenheimer,
that event took place a year ago. So that
but
being said, let's go to a clip. I thought this was pretty interesting. It's from Uncommon Sense posted it.
That day in Munich.
Are you able to hear it?
yes.
Okay. So this is a video of a historian named David Irving, British, no longer alive, but just to give a perspective on how people of a certain generation that's no longer really with us viewed World War II.
Daylight at the other end. And case of Rudolf Hess is one. I've told this story many times over the last 20 years since that day in Munich, 1991. Nothing changes. Gradually, we're getting more documents with no assistance from the British government, which we know is sitting on many more transcripts and many more files. It's a shameful episode. He came to Britain in 1941 to try to stop what he deemed was otherwise inevitably going to happen. It would have saved millions of lives if we had listened. But for the vanity and prestige and historic reputation of one man, Winston Churchill, we took the other route. And millions died, and we lost in Britain everything we had. When I was born, Britain had a great empire, which was a great force for world civilization and good, I think. And we lost it all for this mad, drunken prime minister's vanity, drunk in charge of an empire. That should be on his epitaph, I think. Thank you very much.
So again, that's a David Irving, who's actually a pretty renowned historian.
I mean, he's also a renowned noticer, from my understanding, and obviously people don't necessarily, a large segment of people don't necessarily like him. But yeah, I mean, keep in mind that part of Britain's entire geopolitical flaw was that they made security commitments to Poland, which was foolishness, if ever could be said. I mean, it's basically like America saying, "Hey, let's invade Afghanistan, and we'll guarantee the legitimacy of the Afghan government," or doing the same thing in Vietnam.
I mean, Ukraine comes to mind.
Yeah. So yeah, we're making security commitments for Ukraine that we can't keep.
Nor do we even want to keep. So here's the next clip that I want to show. This is Pat Buchanan, who's debating a Ku Klux Klan member
Yeah, I saw this
about the
coming
merits
around.
of Hitler. This comes from John Harris, but Pat Buchanan, if you're unfamiliar, wrote the book Hitler, Churchill, and the Unnecessary War. Is it Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War? But either way, Daryl Cooper's arguments are nonetheless just a reiteration of what Pat Buchanan wrote, and that was a New York Times bestseller. I don't have on me when that book actually came out, but so if you could look it up real quick.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Now, the Nazis were responsible for the murder not simply of Jews in Germany, but American pilots, American soldiers. They're guilty of all manner of horrid atrocities. They have on their, I guess, on their record some 250,000 American dead. Now, why would any patriotic American, or one who calls himself a patriotic American, be anywhere near the swastika, the insignia of Hitler's Germany? Now, the Nazis were...
So that's Pat Buchanan. Obviously, he wrote the book on this, and he does not view Hitler or Germany in World War II era as a favorable force. He's at the end of the day very pro-America. These guys killed Americans. No, I don't like them, and I feel like that position really resonates with me. I mean, a lot of people are trying to counter signal John Harris over that, but I see no need. I think John Harris was right to put that out. I thought it was pretty based, actually. So my thoughts on that. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, but again, Pat Buchanan just shows that what is being said was not new.
I believe his book came out in 2008. May of 2008.
So obviously there's been a lot of Big Eva and Mid-Eva reaction to this interview, and I don't think any of these people actually listened to it. They just, they ate the sound bites and that was it.
And keep in mind, just to piggyback on Buchanan's point, I mean, he's appealing to the American, like the American identity, in the sense that 500,000 people did end up dying. 500,000 Americans ended up dying in this war. And that's kind of an important number to keep in mind. Like, again, the Civil War was more than that. That 500,000 is just under what I think the North suffered.
The highest combat deaths of any American conflict. So that's something also to note. Even in like the Civil War, a lot of those deaths were disease and not combat.
Yeah, so we got to keep in mind that 500,000 people did die during this war. And
I thought it was closer to 250,000, but I wasn't sure.
I thought it was that in the German front, but.
And then Owen Strachan, very much kind of your liberal reverting evangelical leader. He's very Mid-Eva, in my opinion. I don't know how large his podcast platform is, but his YouTube channel is like pretty small. It's like, this dude has live reads. How? But anyway, this guy, he has me blocked, which is why I'm using Eric Cohn's screenshot here. Anti-Semitism advances. In this interview, Daryl Cooper tries to recast Hitler as an leader overwhelmed by logistics of the war, Churchill as a psychopath and chief villain of World War II. Hatred of Jews runs through all of this. That, friends, is pure evil. Pure evil. And again, this is someone who I don't really think listened to what Daryl Cooper said. I don't think they there's a lot of people who would call Winston Churchill a psychopath based on his prior to World War II experience and resume, which isn't very innocent.
Just to piggyback off point number one, I mean, the Germans weren't able to manufacture the weapons they needed for the war. They had logistical problems, petroleum being number one. They didn't have the oil to fight the war.
Not a long war.
So they didn't have the ability to manufacture weapons, like just firearms. So the Russians could basically outproduce them. The Americans had absolute advantage in production. And we had the assembly line in America. Like, they didn't have that in Germany.
The Russians were also able to reestablish their industrial base closer to the Ural Mountains, because before Stalingrad was one of their primary industrial cities. So one of the chief goals was to kill their industry capacity, but the main goal of Stalingrad was the name. Like that is a trophy on for the Reich, which is why both sides thought it was a must win. But anyway, Owen Strand is kind of woke these days, so I'm not really surprised that he didn't listen and makes this about the Jews. Again, the Holocaust was not talked about, and it shows. This is another one. This is from Russell Moore, who again kind of proves the point that there's a lot of people with a childish understanding of World War II, and he posts a picture of a Captain America comic book, which is, largely what the first Marvel movie is based on, which is a very terrible movie. Like Captain America, the first Avenger is a terrible movie because it's just Captain America. Most of the action's in a montage, and then the Hydra people are just stupid.
And
Like the
they
Germans,
never really end up defeating Hydra in the entire MCU.
I guess not. Like the Nazis did what they thought was a Roman salute. Now I've talked about there's no primary evidence that that's how the Romans saluted, but there is a painting that depicts Romans saluting like that. That's like much later, but we don't have primary sources that say how soldiers greeted each other or commanding officers. But the Nazis thought that they were doing a Roman salute.
Well, I mean,
And then the Hail Hydra's like, we'll do 2 arms instead of 1. It's like,
I mean, the Roman salute was practiced.
So,
the Roman salute was practiced in America, and for whatever reason, it did, fall out of favor.
oh, really? What era? Anyway,
I don't know. I just know I've seen pictures of like when children did the Pledge of Allegiance. They're throwing up a Roman, but I don't know why it fell out of favor.
I don't know either. I can imagine there's a Third Reich reason why it fell out of favor. I tend to like the Second Reich the best. In the First Reich, but I'm of the mind that the Holy Roman Empire was in fact Holy Roman and an empire. Like I think the Voltaire footnote, it's like a quote from a footnote that wasn't published during his lifetime. But Voltaire still refers to it as an empire in most of his other writings. But anyway, I digress. A lot of digressions here. But Russell Moore, don't expect him to really know.
Well, and the other thing
anything.
is, obviously, a lot of people point out the criticism is that he views reality through the lens of like Marvel movies, or other people do it through Star Wars. So it's just ridiculous that the modern human can't view reality except through movies. They can't perceive morality except through like Marvel.
And I made that point regarding Star Wars and how Star Wars was like the ultimate boomer movie. Now, George Lucas, technically a little too old to be a boomer. He's as old as Joe Biden is, I think. Mark Hamill's a boomer.
Silent generation.
And Harrison Ford's actually older than George Lucas, but Mark Hamill's a boomer. So I think the point's going to stand here. But that's kind of how boomers view World War II, and that's also how they view war, a lot of how they viewed war in general. And that showed itself when they were in power and then decided that Iraq was a good idea. We could, free the Iraqis from Saddam Hussein, which turned out to not be a successful idea. Or that the Afghani people would welcome the United States as liberators from the Taliban, and all would be a happy ending and there'd be fireworks, just like at the end of, A New Hope or Return of the Jedi, which isn't really a good movie. I just got to say. I think there's 3 good Star Wars movies, and Return of the Jedi is not one of them. Revenge of the Sith is, actually. But those are my thoughts. And I know people responded to me by saying that, the 60s and 70s had great movies. I'm like, but those movies weren't made by the boomers primarily. But those are the best World War II movies. Look at A Bridge Too Far, which is a fantastic film, 3 hours long. Sean Connery, a few other notable actors in that movie. Again, it's not it showcases the valor of the troops and the strategy and the bit of the personalities and the struggle there, but it doesn't, it's not Saving Private Ryan, which is Hollywood silliness.
Or let's be honest, Darkest Hour, where
Darkest
and again,
Hour.
I like Gary Oldman's a great
There,
actor.
yeah. Well, it's a
But
good movie.
the idea that he rode the London Underground and like talked to the people, and the people were just like, "Yeah, we want to keep on fighting." It's just like probably
we
not.
fight them in the
Yeah,
streets.
that's probably not how it happened.
But you know what is probably like how it happened is like when Darkest Hour shows Winston Churchill just naked walking around at his house while he's doing work and stuff like that, it does show him as difficult to work with, and a lot of the other Allied commanders did not like Winston Churchill, and they said in their writings. So that's just a fact. Like, and now that I guess that brings us to
Well,
Al
going
Mohler
back to
defending his
can we
honor.
go back to Owen Strand real quick? And because of that tweet, I will say I learned a lot of positive things about Winston Churchill, beginning with his immigration beliefs. Like, that I'll give him credit. He had a great immigration stance.
I mean,
that America should have too.
He was a noticer. But he also, like Winston Churchill, thought that Zionism could be used to fight Bolshevism, and that was the solution to it. But obviously that didn't work. But
and still is not working.
Still is not working. So now we're going to get into Al Mohler. Al Mohler is one of the chief people in the Southern Baptist Convention. He's one of the most powerful forces in the Southern Baptist Convention, and not really a force for good. If we're being real honest here, Al Mohler, I think I've not actually watched his video. It's only 10 minutes long, so we'll get through it.
And he's already got the portrait in the background, right?
He does have the portrait in the background and a bobblehead. It just, man, so my initial impression is that Al Mohler sees himself as the Winston Churchill of the Southern Baptist Convention, which I actually think is a very valid comparison. Winston Churchill helped lose the entirety of the British Empire, and people were acknowledging that at the time. The fall of the British Empire is a tragic event. But I guess if you're British, you're not really allowed to talk about that. But Al Mohler is the person who plunged the Southern Baptist Convention into wokeness. He helped do that. He drove the knife in. He was a driving force in raising up the woke leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention who would get into the institutions and produce, Resolution 9. Resolution 9 was when the Southern Baptist Convention in 2019 affirmed critical race theory as an analytical tool. That does not happen without Al Mohler, who fancies himself Winston Churchill of the Southern Baptist Convention. He plunges it, and then he, in 2022 and 2023, is trying to emerge as a hero on the issue of female pastors. And it's like, first of all, you flip-flopped on this issue. Second of all, you have literally paved the way for liberalism in the Southern Baptist Convention so you can be the hero. And you know what this reminds me of? You know what the Winston Churchill discourse reminds me of? Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. Now, if you're a millennial, you know what I'm talking about here. The idea, and who was the villain in that was Shepard, right? General Shepard.
Something like that.
And the plot of it is that in Modern Warfare 1, he was viewed as a failed general because he did not pull out the United States Marines in time, and they got nuked and stuff.
Bombed or nuked, or
yeah. So they he was sort of blamed for a military disaster on the United States, for the United States and their shock and awe campaign against Assad's forces in Saudi Arabia. And
it was in Iraq, I think that happened in.
What is it, Baghdad?
Yeah, okay. It was Baghdad.
Okay, maybe it's been a while since I've played the game, but millennials, you know what I'm talking about here. And from there, in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, Shepard instigates a war. He puts the pieces in place to instigate a war between the United States and Russia so he can be the hero of the war. And that is Al Mohler. Now,
I
I don't
mean,
know if he's
I might not
consciously
be
doing that,
I might
but
not be that cynical. I might just say he's an opportunist,
but
and
that's the
he
opportunist part,
he
you know?
saw the winds a changing and got in line accordingly, and stepped to the front of the line because he knew he's privileged enough to do such.
Alrighty, so
Unlike Winston Churchill, Mohler is kind of royalty in the SBC,
very much.
and Churchill was a highborn, even if his mother was a loose woman, allegedly.
Allegedly. All right, so here's how Mueller.
It's funny how life goes. You find yourself talking about things you didn't expect to in the course of a day. And thus I find myself today ready to speak to defend the honor and the historical legacy of Winston Churchill. And in order to do that, I have to speak pretty personally. I was a 10-year-old boy when my grandmother gave me National Geographic magazine, a subscription, but also just a stack of back issues. And as a 10-year-old boy, I started working through them. And I can still remember a 1965 issue of that magazine I saw when I was just a young boy. And it was a memorial issue, and it honored Winston Churchill. Now, honestly, Winston Churchill died when I was 5. I'm just 10, a 10-year-old boy. But I tell you what, I was a 10-year-old boy trying to understand the great ideas of the age, honestly, trying to understand what history means. And so Winston Churchill has been a part of my life ever since I was 10 years old. I'll just say that's more than a half century ago. And as you can see, even as I'm speaking to you from my personal library, Winston Churchill has loomed large in my imagination, and honestly has been a factor that has very much been involved in my understanding of how ideas work in civilization, how civilizations are established, how they continue, how they survive, good and evil in a world in which we confront both good and evil. And even when it comes to government, a constitutional republic versus a totalitarian and autocratic dictatorial regime. And so I was looking at all of this, and honestly, I was just a 10-year-old boy. I wasn't thinking about the great ideas that would captivate me thereafter. What I was looking at are photographs. Photographs of, for instance, the cranes along the Thames River bowing as the funeral barge of Winston Churchill went by with his flag-draped casket in the back. And it was simply said in National Geographic that this was done spontaneously and without any orchestration by those who controlled those cranes, because those who were working on the docks and on the ships, they had such great affection for Winston Churchill. They believed that he had saved their nation. At the same time, there was a picture that just showed a little woman dressed in such dignified black, holding her purse. I was just 10, and yet I came to understand that was Queen Elizabeth II. Only later would I come to understand that Winston Churchill had been first elected to Parliament under Queen Victoria, and now he was being honored by, and breaking precedent, by the way, in doing so, by the reigning monarch who was there for his state funeral. He began as a member of Parliament under Victoria. He resigned.
So all this so far is about the funeral of Winston Churchill,
I mean,
which
yes.
does not dispute anything that Daryl Cooper said, or Pat Buchanan or a number of other people that questions the legacy. What they're questioning is whether someone who they believe, and with credible evidence, was instrumental in the fall of the British Empire should receive such a triumphant funeral. They're questioning that legacy.
Well, I mean, I don't know about that, the funeral pageantry per se, but
I mean, he's going on for 3 minutes about the funeral.
But I mean, there is a book called The Unknown Warriors, which is basically a crowdsourced collection of op-eds from World War II era veterans from the British and their dominions, which is their colonies, like Canada and in Australia and all of them. And basically it's these veterans, and I think the second edition was published in 2012, that espouse basically their disdain for the fruits of the war and basically what Britain became in their lifetime. And their number one complaint was immigration, and their number two complaint was the mistreatment of the veterans of the war. which I've never heard of like the World War II veterans being like treated like crap by their countries. Like generally,
I've heard of Vietnam veterans being
yeah,
treated
Vietnam, World War One, Civil War, Iraq and
First Blood comes to
Afghanistan.
mind.
So basically, most of the other wars, but like World War II and Korea, you generally associate like the veterans of being well received. Obviously the GI Bills, but yeah, I've never heard like that. Like apparently, a lot of British soldiers complained about the mistreatment and the lack of benefits that they received after the war.
Now, that's a common one. The idea of veterans demanding benefits has been very common in history.
Yeah, every group of U.S. veterans has protested for their benefits, but I don't think you've heard of it with the World War II or the Korean veterans.
I mean, maybe it happened, but it's not like I know the Civil War veterans. That was a big. I think that's the first war that I can recall that being a big thing in American history.
And in World War I, they protested under like Harding, so it wasn't even that long after the war when they were marching on Washington.
Right. So what Al Mohler's saying here has really he's appealing to the way that people honor the dead, and typically, even a dirtbag like John McCain was given the hero's funeral for some odd reason.
Yeah, we can go into a lot of scum that are given state funerals.
Who's that Democrat that died? Lewis or whatever?
Yeah.
That was, a civil rights hero, and it was lauded as a Christian even.
And retired as prime minister under Queen Elizabeth II. Just think about that span of history. But the crucial thing to remember is that Winston Churchill was absolutely central to the story, not only in Great Britain and in the British Empire and beyond, throughout all that period, from Victoria to Elizabeth. And then I came to understand at a far deeper level what it means to affirm convictional leadership. That is, leadership that is based in convictions, in the affirmation of certain essential truths, not just political leadership for expediency, not just administrative leadership, but leadership on a world stage driven by conviction. I came to understand that Winston Churchill saw himself that way. He was born the first son of the second son of the Duke of Marlborough. He was born into a family of titled aristocracy. And I've had the honor, by the way, of standing in the very room there in Blenheim Palace where he was born. His ancestor.
Now, being a son of a duke would make you a prince, right?
I don't know.
The first Duke of Marlborough, was remembered to have saved England at a time of its peril as he led England's army into war. Churchill, born right there in Blenheim Palace, eventually as a boy came to believe that he would play such a role on the world stage, and history records that he did. But I just want to say, when you look at Winston Churchill, I want us to understand that this was someone who, even as a boy, understood that history was being made, and it was being made by those who meant good, and it was being made by those who meant evil. And when you consider what Winston Churchill lived through, if you just take him out of office and just put him in a timeline of history, we're talking about the end of the Victorian age, we're talking about the great tragedies of the 20th century, in particular World War I and World War II. And, of course, in both the First World War and the Second, Winston Churchill played a key role. But it's in the Second World War that was absolutely decisive. And I just want to...
Now, correct my knowledge on World War I. Winston Churchill was responsible for the Gallipoli campaign, and that was sort of a disaster.
That's my understanding. Like his credentials and resume from World War I aren't necessarily, positive. But I mean, the way he frames this is like he was from a child, had aspirations for greatness, and
who else had so that much. Is Joe Biden.
Yeah, I mean, and he had so much potential, and even his reading of history, it's just like every conflict is a conflict between good guys and bad guys. Like again, he's basically reading this Marvel Cinematic Universe like lens into history, that every conflict is good versus evil. That's not how history is. And again, get the British involvement,
especially in World War I.
Yeah, the British had no need to involve themselves in World War I, and they lost a lot of like human talent in that war, as far as like great authors that died. And obviously, I think they actually had some highborn people that died in that war, because that was like I want to say maybe the tail end of the era of like, of royalty, like leading armies into battle was World War One.
Yeah, I mean, and the French didn't exactly represent a good side in World War One.
Well, I
Like,
mean, like
people like to frame World War One in retrospect as, oh, this is about monarchy versus democracy. It's like, well, you do realize that the monarchy side is the good guy, right? But the Germans, again, they fought a defensive war with the Austro-Hungary, and during peace talks, I believe they were blockaded during peace talks. So that forced them to surrender. It's just not exactly a lot. Some would call that treachery, which is very frowned upon in, any ancient writing such as the Bible or, any Greek writing. They frown upon treachery. And you'll see that in Genesis a lot, that it's frowned upon. So anyway, he continues.
Come back and say, I think, even as statements are being made, recent interview in which Daryl Cooper was being interviewed by Tucker Carlson on the Tucker Carlson show. There's a lot of cultural conversation about this. We should not be afraid to ask questions of history. We should not be afraid to ask questions about our heroes. I want to say, without embarrassment, that Winston Churchill has been a hero to me. Now, I'm a Christian theologian, so I want to be very clear. I think the Bible affirms the need for heroes. I think Hebrews chapter 11 makes that very clear. But, the Bible's very honest in that we understand our heroes, warts and all, so to speak. And Winston Churchill was a man who just lived a large life on this enormous canvas of history. And you know what? He made a lot of mistakes. Winston Churchill is remembered for misjudgments. Winston Churchill is remembered for a disaster in military terms at Gallipoli.
Multiple.
All that's true.
What?
Multiple. So, and one of the other disasters is that he was responsible for this boondoggle of intervening in the Russian Civil War. This is 1918 to 1919. So America actually did invade Russia at one point during the aftermath or the tail end and past the armistice of World War One. America actually sent troops into Russia to invade, to intervene against the Bolsheviks. And Churchill, that was Churchill's boondoggle.
It's pretty interesting. Then there's like the Czechoslovakian Legion that like made it all the way around, and they had to fight their way through Russia.
Yeah, I don't think most Americans.
It's a pretty interesting story.
I don't think most Americans even know that we invaded Russia.
Oh.
And they're called the polar bears because they had to spend the entire winter in Russia.
Northern Russia, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is the Arctic part.
And then they had to
Patrick,
by an icebreaker.
Okay, yeah.
Buchanan wrote a book a few years ago about this, and I bought it the moment it came out. And he's asking very, very serious questions about the legacy of Churchill. But, it's a long way from Patrick Buchanan, and I think many of his points, especially in terms of how that relates to America's role in the world, many of those points were very valid. I don't think his criticism of Churchill will stand, not in that sense. And when you have someone now saying in terms of...
So, can I give some credit to Al Mohler here, is that he's actually read Pat Buchanan, and he actually is not treating what Daryl Cooper said as completely novel.
Yeah, I mean,
credit where credit is due. I did not watch this video in advance. I thought it'd be like 100% boomer con.
The reading.
He did some reading. This is more than you can say about Owen Strand. This is more than you can say about Samuel Say, who's not slow enough to write, by the way. And this is more than you can say about Russell Moore, who, used to be buddy-buddy with Al Mohler.
A public discourse that Winston Churchill was the chief villain of World War II. I think you're turning the world upside down. I don't think this is even historical revisionism. I think this is something far more dangerous than that. And I don't think it's just about Winston Churchill. I think it's about far more than Winston Churchill. There are lessons to be learned here. The role of an individual in history can be massive. You take Winston Churchill out of the picture of the 20th century in Great Britain, you have a hard time explaining how Britain actually gets to victory in the Second World War, because it was Winston Churchill in the years he described as his wilderness years who was observing Adolf Hitler and his threat. And he was the one who was warning Britain. And then when the catastrophe took place, and by the way, Winston Churchill was not prime minister when Britain declared war, or that a state of war existed with Nazi Germany, with the German Nazi invasion of Poland. Neville Chamberlain, who had tried to appease Hitler, to great cost to his historical reputation, deservedly so. He was the prime minister. It was.
It's worth mentioning that the Sudetenland crisis was actually correctly handled. No one wanted to go to war, so that the Czech government, which was very oppressive towards every ethnic group around, such as the Slovaks, the Poles, the Romanians, and also Germans, they had like they were like 47% of the population was Czech, but the entire government was Czech. So that created a lot of ethnic tension. No one wanted to go to war for the Czechs.
Well, again, I refer back to my earlier statement where the British were making defense guarantees for Poland, which was an impossible task. And again, 15 days after the Germans invade Poland, that's when the Russians invade. And I think it was only like 3 days after the Germans invaded, the British and French.
I believe it's September 1st and September 3rd.
Yeah. So, in that short period of time, the war is declared. But after the Soviets invade, they did not declare war on the Soviets, despite the Soviets violating the sovereignty of Poland.
Right, because my understanding is they guaranteed the independence of Poland, because it's kind of like a paradox game. You can guarantee the independence of another state. Italy guaranteed the independence of Austria, which did not bode well for Hitler and Mussolini's relationship, but they were able to smooth that over, as history shows. So again, a lot of complexities to history that are very fascinating. Like, I find this era to be very fascinating, and you don't learn a lot of this stuff watching History Channel documentaries or what they have on Netflix.
But really, if you just have geopolitics played in the interest of your own country and you don't make guarantees to other nations that you can't fulfill, like defending Ukraine in perpetuity, then the history actually ends up very differently, because you're not making myopic decisions. You're actually looking at the long-term consequences of your actions. This idea of blowback.
You're going to be like Mitsubishi or whatever Japanese company wanted to have a 200 or 400 year plan and got laughed at by corporate America. You got to think more like that as a country, but that's kind of impossible in any sort of democratic system.
Yes. I mean, like, if you had a 10-year plan that you actually were intent on fulfilling, then your 10-year plan would have been the British and French stay neutral. They let the Soviets and the Germans fight it out. Because again, it's not like the British Empire was like in great shape going into the war, which is why they were in terrible shape after the war. So, I mean, yeah, neutrality would have been in your best geopolitical interest if you had a long-term perspective.
Yeah, instead, now, was it also during Hitler or Winston Churchill's time that they started sea mining Norwegian waters?
I mean, I know Norway was big with heavy water. I'm not sure if that's what you're.
I don't know if that was a factor in 1941 or 1940.
It would have been heavy water. Yeah, Germany was collecting heavy water from the Norwegians for their nuclear program, which was not weapons related at that time, I don't believe.
Well, they needed Norway for iron. Was the biggest, most obvious reason. But Norway was a neutral country, but it was kind of caught between two powers. So the British made like they were going to invade Norway, and then the Germans beat them to it. And then the British do end up invading Norway. That's a disaster, and they pull out to reinforce the French. So, again, World War II is very fascinating.
When Britain, after the war, when Chamberlain's leadership was basically evacuated, that the Conservative Party had to turn to Winston Churchill, who, by the way, had ratted to the Liberal Party decades before and then re-ratted, coming back to the Conservatives. The Conservatives were not inclined to turn to Winston Churchill. They turned to Winston Churchill because they had to. He's the only one who'd been telling the truth about the Nazi threat. And then it's not just that Winston Churchill was necessary for that reason. It was necessary because the Labour Party, the leftist party in opposition, wouldn't be satisfied with any conservative leader at the head of government other than Winston Churchill. It tells you something. Again, the Queen and the doctor.
Wow, the liberals were willing to allow Winston Churchill to be the prime minister, and that's a good thing.
I mean,
The
the way
left-wing
the
party was willing to tolerate Winston Churchill and not any other leader in the Tories would be the party, right? And that's supposed to be a boost for Churchill. I
I'm
don't
pretty
see
sure
that
the
as-
movie
you know.
Darkest Hour, referring back to that, they basically were like, the perception of the movie is that Churchill is being put into a no-win scenario so that he can lose.
Right. Oh yeah, that is.
It's
Yeah.
basically, we'll pick you to be the leader, and it's gonna be a no-win scenario, so that way you're stuck holding the bag. It's a game of hot potato.
Except he does pull it off
Yeah.
at, and what did it cost? Everything.
And let's be honest, you're in a wartime situation. How many people in the Conservative Party would have been like, yep, I want to be the guy in charge of, sentencing men to die for a queen and country, or a king and country in this case?
Workers, the Conservative Party and the Labor Party, coming to a consensus that Winston Churchill was necessary. History proved that that was true. And so you look at the Second World War and you come to understand Churchill's personal leadership was absolutely indispensable. And of course he made mistakes. All the Allied leaders made mistakes. Many of the decisions made by the Allies deserve to be reconsidered, but not the great observation about the threat of Nazi evil. You want to know the truth? Well, just read Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler. Just look at the Wannsee Conference proceedings about the Holocaust. The fact is there's just overwhelming evidence that, if anything, even Winston Churchill had underestimated the evil of the Nazi regime, and furthermore, the imperialist ambitions of Adolf Hitler.
Now, the imperialist ambitions is pretty ironic because the British were an imperial power.
Well, I mean, the only
who
country...
didn't care about the Holocaust?
Oh, Winston Churchill's biographies, right?
Yeah, his memoirs don't mention it once.
Well, can we back up to
thousands of pages on World War II, didn't mention the Holocaust once.
Can we back up to the Mein Kampf reference? Because Mein Kampf is mostly just like a National Socialism platform.
Manifesto, right?
So Hitler's second book would be more about geopolitics, which is probably why which would be probably more interesting to read than Mein Kampf, because Mein Kampf's like 700 pages long. It's not
in prison.
It's probably not as interesting as Al Mohler is making it out to be, and he's probably seen nothing but maybe an excerpt or two.
So the thing about Mein Kampf is it does make Hitler rich, because Hitler goes from being homeless drifter to rich and famous because of Mein Kampf. But I think Hitler said that if I knew I was going to be chancellor, I would have never written Mein Kampf. And Hitler's views do moderate a little bit, but obviously there's other forces at play that kind of pull him back, or pull him, Goebbels with the Kristallnacht was a big factor. That killed Germans' international prestige. That killed them internationally. And Hitler sticks with Goebbels, but at the same time, he didn't order a Kristallnacht to happen and didn't want it to happen because it was bad for the Germans. So Hitler's trying to make Germany an international power. It obviously doesn't work, or it doesn't. He doesn't get any friends on the world stage and has to settle for Benito Mussolini. And because there's a lot of forces in the Nazi Party with varying interest, and obviously Hitler has some bad interest, but he's trying to manage that and doesn't do a great job, in my opinion. But in any case, I don't think Mein Kampf is the best way to. Again, Hitler's not the guy with the plan. He's the guy that's reacting and gambling, and basically firing from the hip. So I don't think Mein Kampf is the best way to understand Hitler, and it might be the best way to understand Hitler in the 1920s, but in the 1930s and 40s, I don't think that's a very useful book for understanding Hitler and his political ambitions at that point. That's just my opinion.
I just don't think the book is, like, again, from what I've heard, the book is not as interesting as, Al Mohler's making it out to be. And it's 700 pages.
I think as we look back to the Second World War, We recognize it could have turned out very differently. It could have turned out with the evil of Nazism becoming the great political fact throughout much of Europe, threatening the rest of the world. Don't take the United
No, there was never the Nazis were underdogs from the very beginning.
Well, I mean, can we just?
They overperformed.
I mean, Winston Churchill is the guy that coined the term Iron Curtain. Like, an Iron Curtain has divided Europe. Or I don't quite remember the quote, but Iron Curtain comes from Churchill, which again reflects the idea that you don't anticipate the blowback of your consequence of your warring. That you don't realize that, okay, you take out Germany and now you're in a Cold War. And never mind the fact that how did the Soviets get nuclear technology and, who gave them that? But now you have two nuclear powers facing off. The idea that, Europe could not have defended itself from a Russian invasion and that they needed America as the backstop. And there's a lot of like Cold War intrigue as far as going to, if you wanted to research that, on all the various plans and techniques on how like America was intent on defending against a Russian invasion. But that's still even the case right now. So the idea of you take out Germany and you basically open the doorway to a Russian invasion west.
I mean, yeah, the smart play would have been to allow Hitler to fight Stalin. Balance of power theory.
Yes, it's balance of power.
Instead, you gave the Russians, or the Bolsheviks, really, all the balance of all the power, and then you need to rely on the Americans. It was not a smart play by the British.
And again, nuclear.
What you thought Hitler was, Stalin became, and you handed it to him.
Yeah, and keep in mind with like the 60s and how, nuclear fear and with the whole Cuban Missile Crisis, like Europe had no ability to defend itself from outside of American assistance.
Yeah, they've also since emasculated themselves and, stuff like that. All right, let's finish.
United States out of that picture. I'm very thankful that didn't happen. And when I ask the question, why didn't it happen, I'm left with the same answer as Britain's late Queen and those crane operators on the Thames. Human beings are indispensable to history. Winston Churchill is one of those indispensable men. In the verdict of history, I do not think he looms smaller. I think he looms even larger. You had people at the time who said Winston Churchill is a political necessity to defeat Nazi Germany. I think in retrospect, that was not only true, it was massively true. I still remain that 10-year-old boy. I still have a fascination with Winston Churchill. And yet I stand not so much to defend his honor as the moral importance of historical truth.
Again, what historical truth did he say, wasn't forwarded? Like he's talking about historical narrative, but he's calling it truth. He didn't say that Daryl Cooper's, other than like the whole, chief villain comment. Like he didn't say that Pat Buchanan was lying about what Hitler did or what Churchill did.
I mean, he just disagreed with the claim. But I mean, again, even if you take out the chief villain of history comment and lump that in with the, slashing your child's throat and that's still a loving act. Like, even if you lump those two together and just like discard them, I mean, it doesn't necessarily interfere with a lot of the other claims Daryl Cooper made that were more or less in line with Pat Buchanan. And I believe Pat Buchanan's claim was that Churchill should have been more friendly with Mussolini to form an anti-German coalition, but at the same, but I'm not sure.
The Italians also wanted to be allies with the British. Everyone wanted to be allies with the British, but the British chose to guarantee the independence of Poland, and then to ally with France.
Yeah, I mean, what happened? Why
make that make sense?
When empires decide to guarantee the freedom and independence of states that they can't guarantee, or governments that they can't prop up,
hostile powers,
it's never a good thing. Like the Soviets wanted to prop up their communist friends in Afghanistan, didn't work out for them. We're doing the same in Ukraine after we failed in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that's not working out. And of course, the British did it with Poland.
Yeah. So that's really all I got for tonight. I don't know if you have any last thoughts.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly just, check out the website and some of the articles we got. Obviously, there's a lot of drama on the Twitter sphere regarding IVF and, pro-life movement. And,
I wrote an article about a pro-life activist who recently announced she got an abortion. You got to check that out. It's pretty cringy. But also, Winning Not Winsome, I do talk about World War II in this book. I give Hitler... I do talk about Hitler and his bunker mentality in this book. So, worth mentioning. But anyway, Winning Not Winsome, 10 Commandments of Spiritual Warfare. It is out on Kindle right now, but next week it is out on paperback. And these are advanced copies that I got. But the patrons of evangelicaldarkweb.org, I've sent out all of the people who have responded to me. I've sent them their copies signed as well. So you definitely want to get on that if you are not on that. Anyway, my name is Ray. This is Anthony. This is the Evangelical Dark Web. If you like this kind of content, do also like and subscribe on your way out. And, if you're a listener as well, do subscribe. But anyway, stay